Can you hear that all right? Can you hear that in the back? Yes? Good. Well, I'm delighted to be here again. I was in Zagreb 10 years ago, too long, and I'm very grateful to the organisers of the Subversive Festival for bringing me here, and also my publishers who have published a translation of this breathtakingly brilliant book, deeply original, path-breaking. Your life will never be the same, I assure you. And I want just to give you a slightest taste of the extraordinary feast awaiting you when you buy this book, by just sort of paraphrasing something I say in the conclusion to it. I say that, I'm just quoting a bit selectively here, Marx had a passionate faith in the individual and a deep suspicion of abstract dogma. He had no time for the concept of a perfect society. He was wary of the notion of equality, and he didn't dream of a future in which we'd all wear boiler suits with our national insurance numbers stamped on the back. He was even more hostile to the state than some right-wing conservatives, and he saw socialism as a deepening of democracy, not as the enemy of it. His model of the good life was based on the idea of artistic self-expression. He believed that some revolutions could be peacefully accomplished, and he was in no sense opposed to social reform. He didn't focus narrowly on the manual working class, nor did he see society in terms of two starkly polarized classes. He didn't make a fetish of material production. On the contrary, he thought that it should be done away with as far as possible. His ideal was leisure and not labour. He lavished praise on the middle class and saw socialism as the inheritor of its great legacies of liberty, civil rights, and material prosperity. His views on nature and the environment were for the most part startlingly in advance of his own time. There has been no more staunch champion of women's emancipation, world peace, the fight against fascism, or the struggle for colonial freedom than the political movement to which his work gave birth. Was ever a thinker so travestied, so caricatured? Well, for more of this unbelievably brilliant stuff, you are going to have to buy this explosive little volume, which has already been banned by the Ayatollahs and the Harvard Business School. Actually, it's not true. It's not even out yet, in fact. It will change your life, and if it sells 1 million copies, it will certainly change mine. Marx has, of course, been one of the most grotesquely caricatured of all modern thinkers, more so even, you might say, than Freud, no doubt because Freud poses much less of a political threat. But it has to be confessed, I suppose, all the same, that one of the chief reasons for this caricature of Marx is known as Marxism. The history of most movements is the history of the betrayal of their founders. Marx was no more responsible for Stalinism than Jesus was for the Spanish Inquisition. Indeed, Marx stoutly denied that he was a Marxist, and Jesus, of course, wasn't a Christian, he was a Jew. Even so, the meaning of a body of work is determined in part, retrospectively, by the history to which it gives rise. And in the case of Marx, as I don't need to say in former Yugoslavia, this was in several respects a pretty shabby and disreputable history, to say the very least. Why that was so, however, is something about which, of course, Marxism itself has a great deal to say. Indeed, one of the claims of Marxism that I talk about here is that it claims to be able to illuminate that monstrous perversity of itself known as Stalinism far more thoroughly and also far more critically than the liberal tradition, valuable though its criticisms of Stalinism have been. Now, the idea that the meaning of the past is determined in large part by what it gives rise to, by what follows from it, by the present and the future, is itself a Marxist notion, not there in the work of Marx himself, but certainly there in the work of the great German Marxist philosopher Walter Benjamin. We normally think, don't we, of the past as being fixed and unchangeable, complete and arrested in itself, whereas the present we think of as open-ended and the future as indeterminate. Benjamin himself, however, didn't think in this way. He thought of the past as something whose meaning was yet to be determined, as something which was fluid, suspended, undecided, up for grabs. The past for him was to be given a determinate shape retrospectively by us, by our own actions in the present and in the future, so that in some curious sense, for Benjamin, we're responsible not just for the present and the future, but for the past as well. And lurking behind this idea is, of course, the great Judaic notion of revolutionary remembrance, that for a certain Judaic tradition of which Benjamin is part, remembrance, recall, commemoration, even in Benjamin's case, nostalgia, can be made into revolutionary virtues. It's quite a feat of dialectics to make nostalgia into a revolutionary virtue, but Benjamin, with his customary panache, pulls it off. What does that mean, that the meaning of the past is to some extent in the possession of the present? Well, for example, whether or not a 15th century Croatian peasant was part of a species which ended up destroying itself is up to us and up to those who come after us. It's we and our progeny, those who follow from us, who can decide whether that peasant belonged to a tragic history, one which perhaps ended in catastrophe, or to a history that struggled through against the odds to a good outcome. We have an advantage over Cicero, Attila the Hun, and the French Jacobins, not that we're smarter and nicer than they were. I mean, it wouldn't be hard to be nicer than Attila the Hun. I mean, even Donald Rumsfeld could manage that. But what we do have, what the edge over them we have, is the advantage of knowing what the history that they were part of eventually led to. And that, of course, was something they couldn't know, but that aftermath of their history is part of its meaning. So in that sense, you might say, it's the future that controls the present, and the future that controls the destiny of the past, that has the meaning of the past to some extent in its power. And this has some momentous political implications, because the single greatest scandal about humanity as far as Marx himself is concerned, I mean the one most sort of mind-warping, breathtaking, outrageous fact, is that, in his own words, the whole of human history has been the history of class struggle, which is to say, translating that phrase, that the great majority of men and women who have ever lived and died on the planet have lived lives of wretched, futile, back-breaking toil for the benefit of a few. It's that traumatizing and mind-bending insight which is silently there as an outrage throughout Marx's own writings. And that, globally speaking, is of course still the case today, which is why Marx lives and will live as long as that is so, I think. Probably one of the gloomiest, most pessimistic philosophers who ever lived was Arthur Schopenhauer. And he's so gloomy that he's actually kind of funny in a way. You know, there's something about unmitigated gloom which is somehow amusing. Somebody ought to do a study of that sometime. Anyway, Schopenhauer thought it would have been far better had the great majority of men and women in history never been born. He couldn't imagine how anybody could reject so flagrantly self-evident a proposition. I mean, for him that was just, you know, plain common sense, that the wretchedness of history far outweighed, you know, the good moments. And there's, you know, quite a lot of that in Marxism, really. really. When Mr. Ford famously said, you know, history is bunk, Marxists would not entirely disagree with that. I mean, even Hegel, despite his reputation as thinking of himself on the winning side, you know, a kind of 19th century Charlie Sheen, a man who thought with becoming modesty that history had now culminated in his own head and was therefore over. Even he considered that the pages of happiness in the human record were few and far between. Hegel had a soberly realistic assessment of the wretchedness of most people's lives. Nietzsche considered that we needed to be amnesiac, forgetful, actively forgetful, when it came to the past, to induce a kind of saving oblivion in ourselves if we were to act creatively and not to be overwhelmed by the blood and misery and toil which lay, as he said, at the bottom of all civilized achievements. The subtext of all civilization, as Benjamin famously points out, is the condition we know as barbarism. For liberals and conservatives, barbarism and civilization are sequential. Yes, first one and then the other. Civilization is precariously wrested, salvaged from barbarism, and is always sickeningly in danger of sliding back into it. Again, for radicals, they're not sequential, but synchronous, together. Sides of the same coin, different ways of telling the same story. For every magnificent symphony or cathedral, there's the hard, anonymous, sweated labour of those who built the material infrastructures which made such civility possible. Civilized artifacts bear within themselves, as it were, the traces of the wretchedness and toil which brought them into being, and one needs then, as it were, to X-ray those artifacts, those objects and documents and texts, to discern within their precious civility those marks of barbarism. And that, I think, is known as a materialist criticism, materialist critique. Freud taught much the same about amnesia when it came to our personal life, to individual lives, what he called repression, the necessary repression of the trauma of our own individual making. I mean, the great scandal for Freud is not infantile sexuality. I mean, everybody had known about that for a long time, not least infants. That was supposed to be mildly funny, actually, but it doesn't matter. They pay my travel expenses. But the great shattering scandal for Freud is that in order to be, you know, the talking, thinking, living, communicating, breathing human beings that we are, an enormous and persistent and continuous repression of much that went into our making must occur, and that traumatizing repression will never cease to scar our psyches from the inside. But notice there, without that repression for Freud, we couldn't be. The ego could not be the talking, communicating, living thing that it is. In other words, the lesson of late modernity, of Nietzsche and Freud, is that repression is good for you, if you believe it. Freud thought that those who dared to tell the sober truth of how very bad things are with us were, he thought, greater friends of humanity than those who peddle dreams of a perfect future, since they keep our eyes steadily on that which needs at all costs to be repaired. They recall us to our frailty and our imperfection, and the recognition of our frailty and imperfection, what the Christian tradition knows as repentance, is the foundation of any moral and political virtue. Realism, which is extremely difficult, of course, is in that sense the foundation of that kind of virtue. Those sober, often bleak and negative thinkers, of whom Freud himself, of course, was famously one, don't allow us to escape from the dreadful vision of how bad things are. But there's what Adorno, in a striking phrase, called the swarming horror under the stone of culture. The swarming horror under the stone of culture. They don't allow us to escape from this dreadful vision with some kind of opiate. Reason, progress, enlightenment, utopia, and so on. But neither do they allow us to perish of the truth. Instead, for them, as for Nietzsche, the resilience with which we might be able to confront this dreadful truth without being turned to stone by it, as it were, is also, may become, the fortitude which allows us to overcome it. And this, as I'll be saying later, is a paradox which lies at the heart of the art form we know as tragedy. What, however, if the wretchedness of the past simply overwhelms us, simply paralyzes our capacity for political action? What if we, in that sense, are the parallel, the equivalent of the neurotic for Freud, who is besieged and paralyzed by deeply disagreeable remembrances? Well, of course, that's entirely possible, but Benjamin has his own response to that when he says it's not dreams of liberated grandchildren which drive men and women to revolt, it's memories of oppressed ancestors. Not dreams of liberated grandchildren, but memories of oppressed ancestors. Again, a profoundly Judaic kind of insight. In other words, it's by looking backwards, and for him only by looking backwards, that we can move forwards in a typical modernist interweaving of the archaic and the avant-garde, of the very old and the very new. Benjamin's Angel of History is driven backwards into paradise with its horrified gaze fixed mournfully on that mounting heap of human wreckage, which is history. And that, of course, is one reason why our rulers seek to erase the past from human memory with their brave, crass talk of marching bravely forwards into the future, to draw a line under it and move on, as the current foolish English cliché has it. But those who try to do this, at least for Freud, will find themselves condemned simply compulsively to repeat the past from which they're trying to escape. They won't emancipate themselves from it unless they have the courage to stare this Medusa's head somehow in the face. If our rulers want to abolish the past, or at least to produce a meticulously edited and sanitized version of it, it's because, among other reasons, the past, of course, carries with it precious resources for the transformation of the future and of the present. So to reduce it to heritage, spectacle, commodity, museum, tale of technological triumph is thus to undermine the present and the future at the very same time. Can we, as Benjamin might have put it, make the tragic narrative of the past live again in our own actions, but not this time as farce, but as comedy? Can the dead be recycled, or as Brecht would have said, refunctioned? Can there be a kind of positive recycling to match the eternal repetitions of the commodity? Well, not to be sure in any literal sense, and that surely is part of the tragedy of history. We can't literally recycle the dead, we can't literally call them to our side, we can assign them new significance, we can write them into a different story altogether, we can, like Benjamin, take advantage of the pliability of the past, its openness to different interpretations to do so. We can try to make the dead what Benjamin calls tradition, by which he means the tradition of those unjustly killed in the struggle for justice. We can try to make them part of the prehistory of better things to come. of which they themselves couldn't, of course, have been aware, we can seek to ensure that their own doomed struggles for justice and comradeship might finally bear fruit in our own political projects, and to this extent hope that they, the dead, will take on some retrospective meaning and value, and that that's part of the value of our own political actions. But in any literal sense, I mean, short of some general resurrection, the dead remain indubitably dead. Actions once taken can't be recovered, though they can be rewritten. There may well be a source of light at the end of the tunnel, though as the pessimists are fond of pointing out, it's usually the headlights of an approaching train. But what of those who perished in the tunnels and in the sidings? What of those whose life and labour has been silently erased from the historical record and who will never be hauled through to a comic conclusion? Marx himself seems to have considered that the development of capitalism is necessary for the building of socialism. If you don't have those material and cultural conditions to draw on, you'll simply end up with what he calls generalized scarcity, with, I suppose, what we might call Stalinism. But he doesn't seem to think that the advent of socialism will then retrospectively justify the moral obscenities of the class history which helped, ironically, to lay down the conditions for it. I mean, how long would a socialist future have to endure, and how vigorously would it have to flourish to justify the sufferings of the history which went into its making? Could anything do so? That, of course, is not to say that Marxism or Marx rejects the idea of progress. Marx himself may be a romantic humanist of sorts, but he's also a good old Enlightenment rationalist, and though the combination of romantic humanist and Enlightenment rationalist is a peculiar one, it's actually hard to beat in many ways. He sees modernity, among other things, as an enthralling and exhilarating tale of emancipation from the benightedness of the Ancien Regime. Those who dismiss modernity, for him, reject secularism, civil rights, feminism, republicanism, democracy, self-determination, though oddly they tend not to resist modern anesthetics when they go to the dentist, which is a certain contradiction within certain kinds of postmodernism. Anyway, that's another story. And Marx, of course, as I've implied, positively lavished praises on those who have bequeathed us this precious legacy. You know, the middle classes, the most revolutionary force he considered in human history, which in a few brief centuries swept every trace of the Ancien Regime from the face of Europe. Well, not quite every trace. I mean, there is the royal wedding also. Actually, I was in Berlin when the royal wedding happened, but I'm very glad to escape it. But on the way from the airport into the city, I kept seeing signs, lots and lots of road signs saying wedding. There is, of course, a suburb of Berlin called Wedding. And I thought maybe this was the Germans' homage. They were all pointing towards Westminster Abbey. Hadn't escaped it after all. I mean, that's an important difference, I think, between Marxists and postmodernists, or socialists and postmodernists. Postmodernists tend to think that the bourgeoisie are just kind of bad for you, like smoking or salt. You know, try asking for salt at an American dinner table. Whereas Marx himself understands that no socialism, which is not based upon the enormous treasures so altruistically accumulated by the bourgeoisie, no socialism not based upon those is likely to survive. And this is one major way, of course, in which the past affects the present, in which we can rewrite, look again at the meaning of the past. We can rewrite, as it were, and Marx does this implicitly, rewrite the history of capitalism, or even the history of class society, as the prehistory of a socialist future. At the same time, of course, despite his belief in progress, at least with a small p, Marx believes that this narrative of emancipation has also been inseparably one terrible nightmare. The history that gives us feminism and democracy and civil rights and dental anesthetics has also delivered us imperialism, exploitation, genocide, Mel Gibson, and just to be impeccably even-handed as far as gender goes, Britney Spears. Moreover, with Marx, it's not just that rather feeble liberal gesture of saying, well, you know, there's a little bit of good and there's a little bit of bad. Those two histories are as interwoven with each other as the two sides of a sheet of paper. They are utterly inseparable. And I think that today there's nobody other than Marxists who are really trying to point that out, that the past history is at once triumph and catastrophe, and the causes of the one lie very close to the causes of the other. Marx has, of course, no quarrel with the great ideals of middle-class society, the great revolutionary ideals of freedom, autonomy, equality, self-determination, the breaking down of barriers between isolated forms of life. He's not interested in the idle intellectual game of dreaming up some fancy new set of values. You know? He's interested in an immanent critique of the values that we have, in raising from the inside, from an endorsement of those great ideals, the awkward question of why they can apparently never be put into practice without inexorably twisting into their opposites, so that freedom for some becomes oppression for many, equality turns into inequality, and so on. All he wants to do is to investigate the mechanisms by which this comes about and unlock those mechanisms so that a genuine future, something for the first time authentically different, not just a tired recycling of past modes of oppression, may come about. And this, as it were, would be the truly historic event for him. The historic event for him, the event that would break with the dreary cycles and eternal repetitions of what he calls prehistory, would be to bring about a history of which then he has almost nothing to say, because his attention is sheerly focused upon the business of unlocking the contradictions which currently prevent that history from flourishing. And because that history for him would be one of diversity, free individuality, creativity, free self-realization, it is logical that it can't be pre-programmed. That's one of many reasons why Marx isn't a utopianist, much though he learned from some of the utopianists of his time, one of whom believed that in the ideal society, the oceans would turn into lemonade. Marx himself would probably have preferred Riesling, I think. He's, on the question of, as I say, of what would then follow from this, he has famously little to say. He's a prophet, not in the sense of peering into a crystal ball. The people who peer into a crystal ball are the soothsayers hired by the capitalist ruling class, you know, to peer into the entrails of the capitalist system and assure their rulers that their profits are safe for another 10 years or whatever. He's a prophet in the authentic Judaic sense of one who warns that unless we change our ways in the present, either the future will be very unpleasant or we won't have any future at all. Though, surprisingly today, despite the American prognostications of the end of time, we're still here. I was going to go home, actually, to be with my family, you know, rather on the last day on Earth, you know. Didn't really feel like giving a talk on Marx, you know, when the heavens were about to fall, but there we are, they haven't, after all. There are, of course, all kinds of reasons for being a Marxist, including just annoying people that you don't like very much. And one of them, of course, is that you don't like having to work, as I said, I think, yesterday. Marxism is about leisure, not about labour. It's It's about how to use the resources accumulated so generously for us by capitalism in order to liberate men and women as far as possible. Marx is fairly realistic, there's no total liberation here, from the drudgery of labour. Capitalism, I mean, what he sees, of course, is so simple and banal that it's astonishing that capitalism has amassed more wealth than any civilization on record, but the way it amasses it, the social relations involved in that, means that we all have to work at least as hard as our Neolithic ancestors ever did. Yes? And this is plainly absurd. This is plainly irrational. Marx attends as much as he does to the economic because he wants to diminish its tyranny over human beings. This is a self-abolishing kind of enterprise, just as being a radical is a self-abolishing enterprise. A radical is somebody who devoutly hopes they don't have to be so, in 20 years' time, because they hope that the conditions which will allow them to stop being a radical will have been brought into being. If there are still feminists and anarchists and socialists in 10 years' time, it would be a great pity. Marx spoke scathingly of having to deal with what he called the economic crap of writing Capital, and he wanted to finish Capital in order to get on with his big book on Balzac. He also remarked that nobody had ever written so much about money and had so little. His model of production is art, not manufacturing soap powder or making automobiles. He wants a society in which, as far as possible, and again there are certain limits to this, men and women will resemble works of art in the sense that they can realize their creative powers and capacities entirely for the sake of it, or to use a more technical theological term, entirely for the hell of it. Yes? Entirely for its own self-delight, as the work of art from the mid-18th century becomes a kind of model in Europe of a sort of self-generating, autonomous, self-determining, self-delighting model for living. And the point is that where art was, to misquote Freud, there humanity shall be. Oscar Wilde understood this very well. It's no accident that Oscar Wilde was, of course, at once an aesthete and a man who wrote a very important socialist pamphlet that was read by the British Labour movement. He saw the connection there. To realise our creative powers and capacities as far as possible, just for the self-delight of it, not for the sake of staying alive or out of duty to God or in service for the state or to make a profit for a minority. And that is also part and parcel of Marx's morality. Marx is a moral thinker in the most classical sense of the word, in, as it were, the Aristotelian or Thomist sense of the word, in that he believes that moral issues involve as many factors, social, economic, cultural, as possible, and that the opposite of that is what we call moralism, which is extracting the moral from that whole historical context. Marx sometimes opposed morality, but actually what he was opposing, though he didn't always know it, was what we would call moralism, I think. Like his mentor Aristotle, Marx is a kind of closet Aristotelian. He believed that the good life, the answer to the question, the great moral question, what is it to live well? It's certainly not to listen to telephones going off. I'm glad that somebody's that the good life is all about fulfilling one's capacities as a radical end in itself. Morality for Marx, as for Aristotle and Aquinas and Hegel, is not in the first place about duty and obligation and responsibility. Those things are important, but they have to be put in the context, the wider context, of the conditions that would allow as many people as possible to develop their own creative capacities. Morality, in a word, for Marx, in the end, is about knowing how to enjoy yourself. Is about what Aristotle calls well-being, which is a more complicated matter, perhaps, than people think, knowing how to enjoy yourself. Whereas, of course, for Kant, if it feels good, then it can't be good. Maybe oversimplifying Kant a little here. There we go. There is, however, a naively romantic sense, as opposed to a sophisticatedly romantic sense of self-realization or self-fulfillment, which Marx falls into quite a lot, I think. Marx is a romantic in the best senses, but also in some of the worst ones. This is the idea that our powers and capacities are naturally, are inherently positive and creative, and the problem is that they're being thwarted or suppressed or blocked by something out there. You know, call it the state, or the ruling class, or patriarchy, or colonialism, or the law, or whatever you like. You have, therefore, in that kind of romanticism which Marx inherited and was deeply indebted to, a sort of expression-repression model, yeah? In which what's really necessary is that whatever is being stifled or repressed can come bursting through the obstacles in a magnificent moment of self-liberation, revolution, conversion, transformation, or whatever metaphor one uses. This, alas, overlooks what is traditionally known as original sin, which has, of course, theologically nothing whatsoever to do with, you know, biting an apple in a garden a long time ago, just as the doctrine of creation, as Richard Dawkins fails to see, has nothing whatsoever to do with how the world got started. Thomas Aquinas, the greatest theologian who ever lived, no doubt, thought it perfectly feasible that the world had no beginning, but he believed in the doctrine of creation. The idea, original sin, that while our powers are undoubtedly creative, they are also somehow tainted at source, and we have to take account of that. They are very deeply interwoven with our destructive capabilities as well. We are the animal, you know, who can liberate and write symphonies and write novels, but we can also create cruise missiles for much the same reasons, because we are a labouring linguistic creature, whereas, you know, squirrels and badgers and moles, as far as we know, are not creating cruise missiles, unless they're being very furtive about it. For Freud, Eros and Thanatos, the life instincts and the death drive, are really sides of the same coin. If only they were simply antagonists, life would be so much simpler. Or, as Freud's recent representative on Earth, Jacques Lacan, might put it, the law and desire are not simple opposites, as a naive libertarianism might imagine. They chase each other's tails, they intensify each other's force, they constitute a vicious circle in which we tend to get hopelessly caught up. Indeed, Lacan points out how St. Paul has much the same insight. Lacan himself, of course, now also has a representative on Earth, an avatar or earthly incarnation who lives just down the road from here, and one wonders who his incarnation might be after that. Yeah. So it isn't, unfortunately, alas, as a certain naive and libertarian romanticism imagines, just a question of allowing unambiguously creative powers to come bursting ecstatically through unequivocally negative obstacles. If it were, for one thing, emancipation would be nothing like as laborious as it actually proves to be. It's because we have to liberate ourselves from ourselves, not only from a power and a law which are safely external to ourselves, from our pathological desire for these things, from our obscene pleasure in the death drive, as well as in our resistance to it, to liberate ourselves from our myriad forms of collusion in our own political oppression. It's because of this, among other things, that of course political emancipation is as hard as it is. Desire is by no means inherently positive, and power and the law are by no means inherently negative. It's one of the defects of postmodernism, I think, to use the word power always in a pejorative or negative sense, forgetting that power is also what can liberate people is a capacity. I mean, I think power is an excellent thing, and personally I can't get enough of it. All depends on who uses it, for what purposes, in what situations, and the staggeringly naive postmodern demonization of power, as though all power were unequivocally oppressive, shows just how politically, wet behind the ears it can be. So what's needed is not just the sort of existential or revolutionary moment of truth in which the positive bursts ecstatically through the negative. What is involved instead, as of course Marx sees and as he inherits in fact from Schiller mostly, is a radical transformation and re-education of our desire, and that in turn, for Marx but not for Schiller, involves a radical breaking and remaking, and that too is part of the traditional meaning of tragedy. Tragedy is the art form which regards our condition as so dire that only by seeking to stare the Medusa's head of the real in the eyes without being turned to stone have we any chance at all of redemption. Things are that bad. Yeah? No mere reformism, no mere cosmetic patching up is possible for the tragic vision. And this in turn, I think, is in different ways, though this is a long story that I can't really tell here this evening, is the insight of Marxism, psychoanalysis and Christianity. Let's just take the latter, Christianity, as a convenient example. Suppose Jesus, before his crucifixion, had said to himself, well, it's not too bad, only 6 hours on the cross, and 3 days in the tomb, and then I'll be up and about again. Nothing to it really, I'll buy that, and paradise for all eternity. It's a deal, I'm up for that. If he had said that, of course, he most certainly would not have been raised from the dead. Incidentally, 6 hours on the cross, I wouldn't say it's exactly sort of easy. In fact, I got into terrible trouble when I once said this on BBC Radio. I never stopped getting letters for months from angry evangelicals, but actually 6 hours on the cross is not at all bad. I wouldn't want it myself, but... And of course, as you know, crucifixion was reserved for political offences only. It's a way of displaying the helplessness of would-be rebels against the Roman Imperium. It was a way of saying to the others, look, this is where it will get you. Most of those poor rebels, thrashed about for days before they died. Maybe Jesus' scourging beforehand, if he lost enough blood, that would have actually been convenient in the end, because it would mean he would have died a lot quicker. Anyway, if Jesus had said that, just looked at his watch and said, well, that's okay, it would have been just some cheap conjuring trick, some sort of now you see me, now you don't illusion. Only by accepting that this is it, that this is indeed the end, that the stark signifier of human history is the tortured and mutilated body of one who spoke out for justice and love and who was therefore done to death by the state. Only by rejecting all the opiates and ideologies and idols and anodyne illusions that block off that terrifying and traumatizing impulse, which is one theologian has summarized as the message of the New Testament: if you don't love, you're dead, and if you do, they'll kill you. There's your consolations of religion. There's your pie in the sky. Only by seeing that this is the last word, that this is where love and justice gets you, would it be possible, perhaps, to recognize that after all, it isn't quite the last word, but a cul-de-sac can become a horizon, that a descent into the hell of nihilism and evil and absurdity and the cackling of the demonic, the pure cynicism of the demonic, of what one might call the extramental vision, that everything is just so much shit, and any belief that there is meaning and value in human existence is a pompous illusion that one simply itches to deface and to debunk. The Iago complex, if you like. Only by descent into that kind of hell would any redemption be possible, and even then, of course, with absolutely no guarantees. Indeed, if you have a guarantee tucked up your sleeve, the lesson of tragedy is that you will never be hauled through to the sources of light. In some paradoxical sense, this must indeed be it, if it's not going to be. Or as Edgar says in a beautiful line in King Lear, the worst is not so long as we can say, this is the worst. So long as there is still the possibility of human language, still the integrity of the verse, still the possibility of affirmation, then in the very act of confronting the worst, in the very act of articulating it, of giving it voice, somehow it isn't any longer quite the worst. What is then at stake here is not knowledge, but faith, which is not to say, of course, an irrational faith. That would be the heresy of fideism, that faith is always the enemy of knowledge. One can speak of a rational faith just as one can speak of a rational love. So the paradox of tragedy, I think, is just that the very ability to stare the terrible real between the eyes is already the beginnings of the tentative, the frail beginnings of a movement beyond it. Marx requires, in his own work, that we look upon that monstrous, deformed, polluted thing of nothingness that he calls the proletariat, which is composed of paradox. You know, it is and is not, it belongs and does not belong. It's exactly like the scapegoat of ancient society. The thing he calls the proletariat, to look upon that and to see in its very loss, of humanity, in its very dehumanization, in its very self-dispossession, to see absurdly, insanely, per impossibile, the signs of potential transformation. Only those who stand counter to the status quo, because they have nothing to lose, can be the signs of an alternative to it. The only image of the future worth having is the failure of the present, not some utopian blueprint. The demented Lear tells his daughter Cordelia that nothing shall come of nothing, but he is deluded. As the play itself understands, something precious can only come of nothing. We once were naught, we shall be all. Which is to say that for that play, as for so much else in Shakespeare, all authentic power springs from a radical self-dispossession and preserves a kind of secret compact with it. As Shakespeare's Prospero says of the deformed Caliban, this thing of darkness I acknowledge mine. When, to change the playwright, when Sophocles' Theseus, king of Athens, encounters the polluted, disfigured, incestuous monstrosity known as Oedipus on the edge of the city, the scapegoat is always on the edge of the city. This blind and broken parody of kingship, monarch and beggarman, something and nothing, poison and cure, hunter and victim, father and brother, this impossible conundrum. When he receives him, a great risk to the community, because the community can be polluted by Oedipus. When he receives them nevertheless into the polis, a tremendous and mysterious power for good will flow from this. That which was rejected will become the cornerstone. That which was nothing shall be all. The terror that threatened the city in its blind fury will now help to protect it. It's this tragic reversal, one as old as the ancient Greek ceremonies of the pharmakos, or scapegoat, which is known in the modern age as political revolution. I would like to see Marx with his notion of the conundrum of the proletariat as in a direct line of descent from this very ancient idea of sacrifice. sacrifice. Sacrifice means the coming to power of the weak and reviled thing. It has nothing to do with ruling class ideologies of people having to tighten their belts for the greater good, and so on. Sacrifice has a revolutionary potential which is disastrously overlooked by so much of the left. The terrible, blind, disfigured, monstrous fury at our gates is always the work of injustice and bears the livid scars of that upon its body. And it is justice, of course, not the killing of bin Laden, which is the only fruitful response to the blind fury at our gates, which is not to say that it may not be too late for that. The terror of our gates, at our gates, the thing of darkness, is indeed partly our own, is indeed the fruit of Western foreign policy in Muslim societies over decades, even if the West is not yet prepared to repent, which is to say, in classical terms, to acknowledge the thing of darkness, the monster, as being far closer to oneself than something safely external. Marxism is a tragic creed, not at all because it's pessimistic, not even, I think, because of its awareness of the dreary cycles of oppression and exploitation that Marx himself won't even dignify with the name of history, which he calls instead prehistory, but more fundamentally because it knows, in the words of the poet W.B. Yeats, that nothing can be sold or whole that has not been rent. Thank you very much today.
Okay, thanks a lot for the lecture. Now we have time for questions and answers, and we have quite a lot of time.